4 days after Grandma's funeral, my family came to the campground I had spent 5 years saving. They already had a buyer waiting, an inspection scheduled, and a plan to remove me before the end of the week. In their minds, the sale was finished. They had counted the money, divided the property, and reduced everything I had sacrificed to a job they believed they could simply terminate. But there was one thing they had never bothered to check. 4 years earlier, Grandma had signed an agreement that made me the one person they could not push aside. They arrived expecting me to surrender. 20 minutes later, my mother could not look me in the eye, and my brother was bending down to pick his keys up from the dock. My name is Jessica Cole. I was 36 when my mother and my younger brother, Beck, came to remove me from the campground I had spent 5 years saving. Before returning home, I had worked as a regional operations manager for a hotel group, managing staff, budgets, and properties that were already in trouble by the time my phone rang. My mother, Ardith, had a way of making whatever she wanted sound like the only reasonable choice. Beck, my younger brother, considered himself the practical one in our family, usually absent when the work was difficult, but always present when something valuable had to be divided. I heard the truck on the gravel before I saw it, and I knew what it meant in the same way you sometimes know a phone call is bad before you answer. It was 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, 4 days after my grandmother's funeral. I was at the marina running the fuel pump test I performed every week, when my brother's truck came down the access road, my mother sitting beside him with a folder pressed against her chest. I kept my hands on the gauge and finished the reading before I looked up. By the time I wrote the number on the clipboard, they had parked beside the boathouse and were walking toward me. My mother led the way. Beck followed with Evelyn's old spare key ring looped around one finger, as though even that already belonged to someone else. Those keys opened the front gate and the main house. They did not open the campground office, the safe, or any part of the business Beck had apparently decided he was about to sell. I met them halfway out on the dock. I did not invite them inside, and in hindsight that was the best decision I made all week, because it meant everything happened outside, on the water, on boards I had paid to replace. My mother started warm. She always starts warm. "I know this has been an awful week," she said, "but there's a lot to handle, and some of it can't wait." Then she opened the folder and told me they had an offer. A resort group from the city wanted the entire property, 60 acres of lakefront, 19 cabins, the boathouse, the general store, and the marina. She named a number large enough that I understood why she had rehearsed the conversation during the drive-out. Beck could barely wait for her to finish. Lakefront like this almost never comes up with a marina permit already attached. "They want the whole shoreline, Jess. Their people are walking the property Thursday." That permit, the one I had saved in the middle of winter with my hands split open across the knuckles. My mother nodded toward the office. "We need the master keys, the safe combination, and whatever login you use for the reservations. It'll go more smoothly if the family has everything organized before they arrive." I asked when they had started speaking to the resort group. My mother hesitated, but Beck had never been able to leave a silence alone. First conversation was last fall. Last fall, Evelyn had still been alive. She had still been walking down to the general store with a cane on clear afternoons and sitting on the porch where she could watch the lake. "It wasn't behind her back," my mother said quickly. "We were only exploring possibilities. I asked what they thought would happen to me if the sale went through." My mother gave me a look that was almost affectionate and somehow worse because of it. "Sweetheart, did you honestly think working here long enough would make the place yours?" Beck laughed, not viciously. That would have been easier. He laughed the way people laugh when a child has misunderstood something obvious. "Don't worry about the money side," he said. "When it closes, we'll mail your final paycheck. We'll make sure it's a good one. Nobody's trying to shortchange you." Then he held out his hand. "The master keys, Jess. 5 years, 19 cabins. A marina permit I had saved in winter with a borrowed impact driver and a space heater running from an extension cord. An apartment I had sold. A woman I had sat beside through the final months of her life, while she slowly lost the ability to finish her sentences. And my brother had come to fire me from the campground I had kept alive. I placed my coffee on a piling because my hands had gone cold and I did not trust myself to hold it. Before I tell you what I said, you need to understand what my family had never once bothered to ask. Our name has been on the sign at the entrance to the campground since my grandfather put it there. He began with 6 cabins and a narrow wooden dock, then added the general store, marina, and boathouse one profitable season at a time. I had a real career before this. Hotel management, corporate side, the kind of job with regional directors, name badges, and more airports than any person should have to remember. I was good at it. I had an apartment I liked, in a city I liked, and exactly the amount of family contact I wanted, which was Christmas and 1 phone call a month. Then my grandmother Evelyn fell. She was in her 80s and had been running the campground alone since my grandfather died. One morning in April, she missed a step on the dock and broke her hip, her wrist, and something in the middle of her that never completely recovered. She spent more than a month in rehabilitation, complaining about the food and correcting every nurse who called the campground a resort. When it became clear that she could no longer manage the place alone, we held a family meeting. My mother, Ardith, listed all the reasons she could not take over: her job at the clinic, her back, the distance, and the life she already had. "You know I'd be there tomorrow if I could," she said. "You know that?" Beck offered what he always called the practical answer. List it. Sell while lakefront prices are high and let somebody with real capital fix it. Evelyn sat at the end of the table in a wheelchair with her wrist in a brace. She did not argue. She simply looked toward the window, and I could almost see her imagining strangers walking her shoreline with clipboards. I volunteered to take over for 1 year. "I'll stabilize the business, get the books in order, and then we'll decide." That was 5 years ago. The first year showed me how close the campground was to disappearing. The reservation system consisted of a paper ledger and a landline. Some cabins had not been renovated since the 70s, and the insurance policy described a smaller version of the property than the one that actually existed. That autumn, a storm tore the roofs from 3 cabins and sent a tree through the general store. Insurance covered part of the damage. I found the rest. I hired a carpenter, but hired makes it sound as though I stood at a distance and supervised. Most days I was beside him, holding the other end of the plywood and learning which tools could survive being dropped in mud. That winter, the state inspector arrived. It was January, cold enough for ice to form around the shallow edges of the lake. He had come because of fuel containment violations that predated me by years, involving a spill barrier that had been noted twice and never corrected. After examining the fuel dock, he stood beside the pump with his hands in his coat pockets. "I'll be straight with you," he said. "The permit renews in March. If this isn't corrected, it won't renew, and if that permit goes, the marina is finished. Not suspended, finished." I asked him to show me exactly what compliance required. He did, in more detail than he had to, and I have always suspected it was because he was not a man who enjoyed closing places. I spent the rest of that winter rebuilding the containment system with a borrowed impact driver, an extension cord, and a space heater that barely kept my hands moving. My knuckles cracked open from the cold and stayed that way until spring. I photographed every stage, saved every receipt, and learned more about spill barriers than I had ever intended to know. The inspector returned in March, examined the entire dock again, and signed the renewal. Before leaving, he handed me the permit. "I've closed 4 marinas in 2 years, he said. "You're the only person who actually did the work." I sat in my truck afterward and shook until I could hold the steering wheel properly. When I told Evelyn, she said, "Well, obviously," and asked what we were having for dinner. That was Evelyn. She was not warm in the traditional sense. Her affection usually arrived disguised as a correction, an expectation, or a plate she had quietly kept warm without mentioning it. In the second year, I discovered the loans. 2 old debts were secured against the business, and one of them had been extended so many times that nobody seemed to remember when it began. Once the notices arrived, there was no clever solution. Either we paid them or parts of the operation would be sold. I called my mother. She said she wished she could help. I called Beck. He said investing more money would be throwing good capital after bad, so I sold my apartment. It was not a noble moment. I did not stand in the empty rooms thinking about legacy. I was angry, exhausted, and too invested to watch my grandparents' work get divided into auction lots. The only meaningful asset I had left was a 2-bedroom apartment in a city where I had barely slept for more than a year. I sold it and put the money into the company. You cannot simply hand a corporation that kind of money and pretend it means nothing. My grandfather had created an operating company decades earlier, and that company held everything that made the campground function: the marina permit, the operating license, the insurance, the reservation contracts, and the business name. The land itself was separate. The company operated on it under a recorded, long-term lease that automatically renewed as long as the campground remained open and complied with its permits. My grandfather had structured it that way, so a bad year, a family argument, or a future sale could not destroy the business overnight. He had also placed a minority interest in an employee trust for the people who had helped build and run the campground over the years. It gave the longtime staff a stake in the company and prevented any one family member from stripping the operation for parts. Warwick, the accountant who had handled the books since I was a child, explained the rest across a desk in his strip mall office. A fish tank bubbled behind him while he spoke in the flattest voice I had ever heard. "You are not making a donation," he said. "You are making a capital contribution. If your money is saving the corporation, the ownership records need to reflect that." A business attorney prepared a capital contribution and ownership agreement. The money from my apartment went directly into the company to clear its debts and fund the required repairs. Evelyn approved a new ownership structure that gave me the controlling voting interest, while the employee trust kept its existing minority stake. She read every page, asked several questions, and corrected the attorney when he misspelled my middle name. She signed voluntarily in front of Warwick and the attorney, and the new ownership structure was properly approved and entered into the company records. When everything was finished, she looked across the table at me and seemed satisfied for the first time in months. "Good," she said. "Now what you saved cannot be taken from you by people who waited for it to become valuable." Then she asked if we could stop at the pharmacy because she was out of heart medication. We never discussed the paperwork again. I did not hide the transaction. Warwick had copies, the attorney had copies, I had copies, and the change appeared in the company's stock ledger, board records, and annual ownership statements afterward. But I did not announce it either. For 4 years, I carried one private, embarrassing hope: that my mother would drive out one day, look at the new roofs and the full reservation board, and finally say, "I didn't know you did all this." I never needed a grand apology. I only wanted the noticing. Nobody asked how the debts disappeared. Nobody asked who funded the repairs, why the permit still existed, or how the new reservation system had been paid for. To my mother, I was the daughter who had suffered a little breakdown and moved home. To Beck, I was the sister keeping the property warm until the market improved. He said it once at Christmas in front of several people. "Jess is managing the place for now, like I was staff, and I let him. That is my part in this, and I will own it." Every time somebody treated me like hired help at a business I had risked everything to save, I smiled and passed the potatoes because correcting them would have started a war, and I was too tired to begin one. Being underestimated can be restful in a way nobody admits. Evelyn's health gave out in March at the end of a long winter. We moved a bed into the front room so she could see the lake. I handled her medication, appointments, and the nights when she woke disoriented and asked whether my grandfather had checked the fuel delivery. Neither my mother nor Beck came to the campground during those final months. My mother visited Evelyn twice at the hospital. Beck called on her birthday. I was there when she died. I will say that plainly and move on, because it was hard, and it belongs to me. After the funeral, the estate attorney informed us that Evelyn's will left the land itself to my mother and Beck in equal shares. They inherited the shoreline, cabins and buildings subject to the company's recorded lease. Apparently, they heard only the word inherited. They did not ask what the lease covered. They did not ask who owned the company operating on the land, and they did not ask why the attorney kept referring to existing corporate rights. At the reception in the church basement, Beck placed one hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry about the property," he said. "Mom and I are handling everything now. A firm from the city has already been in touch." I did not answer him there. 4 days later, he arrived at the campground with my mother, a folder, and Evelyn's old spare keys. Now he was standing on the dock with his empty hands stretched toward me, waiting for the master set. I looked at Beck's open hand, then at my mother's folder and the boards beneath our feet. My mother had asked whether I truly believed that working hard would make the campground mine. Beck had promised to send my final paycheck once the sale closed, a final check. Standing on that dock, I finally understood that my mother would never notice what I had done unless the truth prevented her from getting something she wanted. I did not feel powerful. I felt tired. A family with 2 children was fishing from the swim dock farther down the shoreline. One of the children was whispering too loudly about a bobber, and I remember deciding that I was not going to become a woman who screamed at her family in front of a child on vacation. "You can sell whatever interest Evelyn left you," I said. "But you cannot sell them an operating campground, not without me." My mother exhaled through her nose. "Jessica, the land belongs to Beck and me now." The attorney explained it. "The land is one thing, the business operating on it is another." Beck frowned. "It's the same property." "No. The company holds the marina permit, the operating license, the reservation contracts, the insurance, and the campground name. It also has a recorded, long-term lease on every part of the land used by the business. Anyone who buys your interest steps into that lease. They do not get to erase it because they want a clean shoreline." My mother made a dismissive movement with one hand. "That sounds like paperwork." "It is paperwork," I said, "the kind that decides what people actually own." Neither of them spoke. Then I told them, "I own 70% of the operating company." Nobody moved. The employee trust owns the other 30. I received my controlling interest 4 years ago, when I sold my apartment and put the money into the corporation. A business attorney prepared the agreement, Evelyn approved it, and the ownership records have been on file ever since. Beck said my name once, like a question. I continued because I wanted it finished. "The resort group can offer to buy the land subject to the lease, but they cannot purchase a functioning campground without the company that controls the permits, bookings, insurance, and business name. They cannot move the marina permit into a new company, and they cannot terminate the lease because they dislike who controls it. Any competent attorney will work that out before the first meeting ends." My mother's face went completely still, the way a screen goes blank when the power fails. Beck's fingers opened. Evelyn's old spare key ring struck the dock between us. He did not throw it. It simply slipped from his hand and landed on the boards with a small metallic sound. He looked down at it as though he could not understand how it had gotten there. At that exact moment, one of the children on the swim dock caught something and began shouting. My mother barely seemed to hear him. "You're lying," she said. "You're inventing this to stop the sale." I removed 2 business cards from the clipboard beside the fuel pump. One belonged to Warwick. The other belonged to the attorney who had prepared the ownership agreement and reviewed the recorded lease. "Call either of them." My mother walked back toward the truck with her phone already in her hand. Beck remained on the dock, staring at the keys. "How could you not tell us?" he asked. I looked at him. "How could neither of you ask where the money came from?" He had no answer. My mother called Warwick from the truck with the door hanging open. I could not hear his side of the conversation, but I watched the certainty leave her posture one piece at a time. When she returned, she did not look at me. "We'll discuss this later. We'll discuss it when you're ready to talk about what actually happened here," I said. "Not about a sale you already spent in your head." She closed the folder. Beck stared at the key ring for another second, then bent down, picked it up, and followed her toward the truck. They left without the master keys, the safe combination, or the reservation login. I sat on the edge of the fuel platform with my legs hanging over the water for most of the morning. It did not feel like winning. Nobody applauded, and nothing inside me felt lighter. I had simply told my family something they could have discovered 4 years earlier by asking one honest question. While I sat there, I remembered a morning from the previous spring. Evelyn had come down to the dock while I was setting the lines. She was using a cane by then, and it took her a long time to reach me because she would not let me help. She watched me coil a rope, took it from my hands, recoiled it correctly, and gave it back. "Over, under, then the tail goes inside," she said. "Your grandfather did it your way once. It came apart in a storm and we lost a boat." Then she looked across the water. "You gave up a great deal to come here." I told her it was fine. "I didn't say it wasn't fine," she replied. "I said you gave up a great deal. Those are different statements." Then she turned and walked back toward the house. That was as close as Evelyn usually came to saying thank you, and I have replayed it more times than I would admit out loud. I called Warwick after my mother and Beck left. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, I heard paper moving on his desk. "Good," he said. "That is what the structure was designed to prevent." I asked him what he meant. "After your grandmother signed the ownership agreement, she asked whether Ardith or Beck could reverse it after she died. I told her no, not with the transaction properly approved and filed." He paused. She said, "That's the point." I closed my eyes. She knew exactly what she was signing, Jessica. She wanted your mother and brother to inherit something, but she did not want them to destroy the business you had saved. The land gives them value. The lease and the company prevent them from turning that value into a demolition crew. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I finished the fuel pump test, because it was still Tuesday and the marina still needed to open. If you are somewhere in a version of this right now, quietly carrying something everyone around you assumes is being carried by nobody, tell me where you are watching from tonight, just the city and the time. I read them all, and I have begun to notice how many of us there are and what hours we tend to be awake. The resort group contacted me the following week. I informed them in writing that my company would not sell its operating rights, transfer its permits, or surrender its lease. They were still free to purchase my mother and Beck's interest in the land, but without the campground business, their proposed villa project made no financial sense. They wanted to tear down the cabins, relocate the marina, and build across the shoreline. Without my company, my permits, and my agreement, none of that worked. My mother sent 3 messages asking me to reconsider. Beck sent none. For several weeks, I heard almost nothing from either of them. The estate attorney continued handling the transfer of Evelyn's land to my mother and brother while I prepared the campground for summer. I could have cut my family out completely. People ask me why I did not, and I understand the question. I had a whole folder of reasons, but there was one memory of Beck that would not leave me alone. During my second winter at the campground, the boathouse flooded after midnight. I was there alone with a shop vacuum and water rising around my boots when Beck arrived. Somebody in town had called him. He worked beside me until nearly dawn. He never took a photograph, never told anyone, and never asked for credit. Then he did not return for years, and whenever I mentioned that night, he changed the subject as though helping embarrassed him. I began to think Beck had always wanted to be the kind of person who showed up but did not know how to become that person consistently. It was easier to play the man waiting for the property to sell, so when he finally called, I did not offer forgiveness. I offered terms. "I'm not giving up my shares," I told him. "I'm not sharing control, and I'm not pretending the last 5 years didn't happen." He remained quiet. "But if you and Mom want to be here, you can be here. Not as owners of the business, and not as heirs waiting for another payout. As family. I'll believe the change when I see the work, because words are not going to be enough." My brother came first. On a Saturday morning in May, I walked out of the office and saw his truck parked beside the boathouse. He was standing on a ladder, pulling rotten fascia from the north side, repairing storm damage I had postponed for 2 years because it was not urgent and there was always something urgent. I watched him for a minute before he noticed me. When he climbed down, we did the awkward thing where neither of us knew what to do with our hands. "What are you doing, Beck?" He looked past me toward the lake before answering. "I didn't come to take anything this time. I came to carry some of what I left on you." I did not cry, but it was close, so I turned around and went to get him coffee, mostly because I needed 30 seconds with my back to him. He returned the following Saturday and the one after that. He replaced the fascia, painted every canoe we owned badly, and helped the crew put the docks in for summer. He was noticeably slower than everyone else, complained more than anyone else, and kept showing up anyway. He still comes out on Saturdays when something needs fixing. I have offered to pay him more than once, but he says he is not there as an employee. He is there because he should have been there years ago. My mother took longer, and it was harder. I am not going to smooth that part out for you. The first time I saw her after the confrontation was in the plumbing aisle of the hardware store. She held a package of washers that I am almost certain she did not need, and neither of us had anywhere to go. She asked how the season was shaping up. I said fine. She asked whether the cabins were full for June. I said mostly. Then she looked down at the washers. Beck says he's been helping. He has. She opened her mouth, and I watched her try to get something out and fail. Whatever she had intended to say was too heavy for her to lift, so she put it back down. She said she needed to go and left with the washers. She came to the campground the week before opening without calling first. She carried a box containing Evelyn's photo albums and the old recipe book with the metal spine. The book always opened by itself to the lemon cake Evelyn had made every opening weekend for 40 years. My mother placed the box on the office desk but kept her purse over one shoulder, as though she was not sure whether she would be allowed to stay. Then, without one of her usual soft introductions, she said it. "I'm your mother, and I didn't see you. Evelyn saw you. I wish it had been me." I did not tell her everything was all right. That is usually the moment where the music swells and the hurt person makes the apology easier for everybody else. But it was not all right, and I was not going to give her that. "I hear you," I said. "It matters that you said it. We'll see what happens next." She cried a little. I did not. Then she asked whether she should leave the recipe book or take it home. "Bring it Saturday," I said. "Make the cake." She brought it and made the cake. Evelyn's version had always been better, but nobody complained. My mother started making it every opening weekend, then began arriving early to prepare breakfast for the seasonal employees. At first, she stayed in the kitchen because it gave her something to do with her hands. Over time, she began sitting with me after the breakfast rush, drinking coffee without asking what her land interest might someday be worth, or whether I had reconsidered the resort offer. The change did not happen in one apology. It happened through early mornings, dirty dishes, and quiet hours in which nobody asked me to surrender anything. On the first opening night after Evelyn's death, we placed a long table beside the lake for the staff, the summer workers, and the two families who had helped run the campground for more than a decade. My mother brought the lemon cake. Beck walked down to the marina and switched on the dock lights. Evelyn had always done that, and my grandfather before her. Nobody asked Beck to take over the task. He saw the light fading and went. Halfway through dinner, Dolores, who had managed housekeeping since before I was born and was the only person alive who called my grandmother Evie, stood with a plastic cup in one hand. "I'm not making a speech," she announced. Then she made one. "Evie lived on this lake most of her life and never properly thanked any of us." Everyone laughed. But she sat on that porch with her coffee at 5 a.m, watching to see who arrived. She knew who showed up. She always knew. Dolores looked down the table at me and sat again. I had to study my plate for a moment. Later, while people were carrying the chairs back uphill, Beck approached me with one hand closed around something. When he opened it, Evelyn's old spare key ring rested in his palm, the same ring he had dropped on the dock. "I've kept it in my truck since that day," he said. "Every time I looked at it, I remembered standing there and asking you for keys to a place I had never lifted a finger to save. I took the ring from him." He looked toward the boathouse he had repaired. "I spent years counting down to selling this place. I think about that every time I drive through the gate. I still hear that line sometimes," I said. "The one about mailing my final paycheck." He looked down. "I wish I could take it back." "You can't," I said. "But what you do next still matters." He nodded and looked at me properly. "I'm sorry, Jess." I placed Evelyn's spare keys in my pocket. Then I removed one small key from my own ring. It opened the front gate and the main house, but not the office, the safe, or any part of the business. I placed it in his hand. "This is not an ownership key," I told him. "It's so you can let yourself in when you come as family." He laughed with wet eyes and called me a hard case, which is one of the kindest things my brother has ever said to me. The following morning, I woke at 6. Mist hovered above the lake and would be gone before 8. Beck was already near the racks preparing the rental boats. The kitchen light was on in the main house, which meant my mother was making breakfast for a crew of teenagers who would eat everything and thank her for almost none of it. At 7, I rang Evelyn's brass bell. I still own 70% of the operating company. The employee trust still owns the remaining 30. My mother and Beck own the land subject to the company's lease, and they receive the rent Evelyn intended them to have. That arrangement is not changing because my family finally learned to be kind. An earlier version of me might have handed control back the moment somebody apologized. I do not let that version of myself near legal documents anymore. But I did not lose my family either. I did not have to destroy them to protect what I had built. I had to speak the truth once, clearly, on a dock where they expected me to surrender the keys, and then allow everybody to decide who they wanted to become afterward. My brother came back with tools, and my mother came back with Evelyn's recipe book. In their own ways, they both returned ready to carry some of what they had left on me. I will take that. Forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing happened. I never said it did not happen. I chose, with my eyes open, to let their future behavior matter without allowing it to rewrite the past. And I decided that I would rather have my mother making Evelyn's lemon cake badly in my kitchen than spend the rest of my life being right about her from a distance. Do you think Jessica was right to let her family back in without giving up control? Or would you have closed that door for good? Tell me what you would have done. Thank you for staying with Jessica's story until the end. If you'd like to hear another one, leave a like and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you back.